Welcome to my final TV talk on The Great Gatsby. In this, we will look at F. Scott Fitzgerald and the artistic technique of The Great Gatsby. We'll be glossing over a few things about Fitzgerald and Zelda that have been discussed in other presentations. So if you'd like to see these, please look at my YouTube channel. F. Scott Fitzgerald said, "Gatsby started out as one man I knew and then changed into myself." He told this to a friend. Fitzgerald knew himself. He was one doomed romantic writing about another. Here's Scott at age 15. He was known for keeping meticulous notes in something he called a thought book. This was later put into publishing. In one column, he listed all the girls he liked in order. Interestingly enough, his first choice was the one he described as not pretty, but the most interesting talker. Brains wins over beauty once again. Here's a picture of Zelda and Scott in the early 1920s. And here they are on the streets of New York with their daughter Scotty, of whom Zelda reportedly said when she was born, "Good, I hope she's a beautiful little fool." Of course, that became one of the classic lines of The Great Gatsby. Since Scott was not from old money and didn't have the wealth to support Zelda in the manner the Southern Belle was used to, he had to accomplish something first. In 1920, This Side of Paradise was published. Zelda married Scott less than 2 weeks following the publication. Scott Fitzgerald introduced Ernest Hemingway to Max Perkins, his editor, and of course, publishing company of Scribner and Sons. Here they are in the top left, Paris, 1925, Hemingway and Fitzgerald. Those are two pictures of Hemingway on the bottom of this page. And of course, because of Hemingway, we have the Dos Equis man. That's him on the top right. Zelda and Scott had a violent love affair in so many ways. Here's a letter in late summer 1930. By this time, their marriage was a sham. Zelda wrote to Scott, "So I went on and on, dancing alone. And no matter what happens, I still know in my heart that it is a godless, dirty game, that love is bitter." Zelda was an accomplished artist in her own right, and here's a picture she painted of the famous Brooklyn Bridge. In another letter she wrote, not too long after the first one, in 1931, when she was in Montgomery, she said, "I keep the light burning on your desk, so I'll think you're there when I wake up. But then it's awful to have to turn it out when it's day." The first draft of what we now know as The Great Gatsby has been published by Princeton as Trimalchio. His publisher, Max Perkins, suggested numerous changes, and Scott was unsure about the text at that point anyway. But within 2 months, he turned it into The Great Gatsby. Scott's rejected choice of Trimalchio drops a broad hint as to Gatsby's character, since this character is taken from the name of a former slave in ancient Rome who becomes rich and tastelessly tries to win the respect of the first-century establishment. The story was told in the Satyricon by Petronius, and Fitzgerald shifted it to New York City and Long Island of the 1920s. Trimalchio is as obsessed with time as Gatsby, and has a clock and a uniformed trumpeter in his dining room to keep telling him how much of his life is lost and gone. Many of his guests do not know him and insult him behind his back. Though his extravagant vulgarity is thoroughly mocked, there's an appealing vigor, vitality, and vastness about him. Perkins' suggestions were that Gatsby and his career must remain mysterious, of course. But whereas the other characters are marvelously palpable and vital, Gatsby should remain somewhat vague. Perkins went on to say, "The reader's eyes can never focus upon him. His outlines are dim." The artist, Francis Cugat, is the one who was tasked with painting the cover for the first Great Gatsby. This is an early sketch, of course, that was rejected, but it was based on the working title of the novel at the time, which was Among the Ash Heaps and the Millionaires. The iconic cover, which graces the final first edition, started out with sketches such as these. In a letter to Max Perkins before completing the novel, Fitzgerald wrote, "For Christ's sake, don't give anyone that jacket you're saving for me. I've written it into the book." This is one of our first clues that Fitzgerald took Cugat's cover art and included some of its emotion, some of its color, some of its themes into the text itself. The Great Gatsby was published in April of 1925. Fitzgerald began working on it in 1924. It sold 20,000 copies that year and did poorly in the reviews, but by now its sales total nearly 35 million copies worldwide. So in this presentation, we're going to look at the technique that Fitzgerald used in writing the text, and that includes cross-references. Fitzgerald stated he wanted to write something complex and extraordinarily beautiful. And there's no doubt that the text is complex and the language poetically beautiful. Gatsby's beginning and end through cross-references. Fitzgerald's use of a blank canvas, both as an homage to modernist artists, but also a reference to the very American idea that we can paint whoever we are into being. We can manifest our destiny. So Fitzgerald used the word canvas just a few times in the text. In chapter 3, on page 44 of my version, 40 of another edition, at least once a fortnight, a corps of caterers came down with several hundred feet of canvas and enough colored lights to make a Christmas tree of Gatsby's enormous garden. This is the first use of canvas in the text, and we have this canvas at the birth of Gatsby's parties, which are to draw in Daisy, in the hopes that Daisy will someday wander into one of these parties. The next time we see canvas is in chapter 6. James Gatz, that was really, or at least legally, his name. He had changed it at the age of 17, and at the specific moment that witnessed the beginning of his career, when he saw Dan Cody's yacht drop anchor over the most insidious flat on Lake Superior. It was James Gatz who had been loafing along the beach that afternoon in a torn green jersey and a pair of canvas pants. Literally at the birth of Jay Gatsby, he's wearing a pair of canvas pants. Because in America, we're a blank canvas. We paint whoever we are into being. The last time is Gatsby's funeral in chapter 9. I'd never seen him since then. I don't know how he knew about the funeral or even his name. The rain poured down his thick glasses, and he took them off and wiped them to see the protecting canvas unrolled from Gatsby's grave. 3 uses of canvas: the parties for Daisy, the birth of Jay Gatsby, and the death of Jay Gatsby. Our next cross-reference is going to look at Gatsby grasping for something tangible and always coming up empty. Fitzgerald repeats the image of Gatsby reaching out for something almost as if in prayer or desperation, but always coming up empty. In chapter 1, right at the end of the chapter, Nick says, the first time he ever spotted Gatsby, "But I didn't call out to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms toward the dark water in a curious way." Nick sees Gatsby reaching out toward the water almost as if in a prayer. He describes it as a curious way. At this point, he doesn't understand the significance of that, even as he says that he turned and saw the green light. In chapter 6, we see this again. And it says, "Here in the shadow of his house, just out of reach of his hand." And that's Gatsby's hand. Something just out of reach of his hand. In chapter 8, one more time, he stretched out his hand desperately, as if to snatch only a wisp of air. And the last time we get this image is in chapter 9, the final paragraphs of the text. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him. So 4 times Fitzgerald gives us this refrain of Gatsby reaching out but failing to come up with anything. Fitzgerald also used the word vanish, or the image of something vanishing, to designate his view of the American dream. So some of the things that vanish in this text are, of course, Gatsby, his smile, the green light, the trees upon which to climb the social ladder, the symbolic trees, Daisy, the city full of bright lights, and the promise of a new world. In chapter 1, right there again at the end of the chapter, Nick says, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. In chapter 4, we get this again. As if you would like to believe in yourself, this is Gatsby's smile, and assured you it had only the impression, precisely the impression of you that at your best you hoped to convey. Precisely at that point, it vanished, and I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, a year or two over 30. Chapter 5. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. Compared to the great distance that had separated him from Daisy, it had seemed very near to her, almost touching her. This is the reunion chapter, once Daisy is actually in Gatsby's arms, which is almost dead center, midpoint of the text. The significance of that green light had vanished forever. In chapter 8, in retrospect, he knew that Daisy was extraordinary, but he didn't realize just how extraordinary a nice girl could be. She vanished into her rich house. Again in chapter 8, as it sank lower, seemed to spread itself in benediction over the vanishing city where she had drawn her breath. And again, the final few paragraphs of the text, chapter 9, became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the new world. Its vanished trees, the trees that made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. Fitzgerald constantly gives us images of things vanishing, always related in one way to Daisy or Gatsby or both, to remind us of the vanishing American dream. One of the more interesting cross-references in this text is linking Daisy's mouth to Gatsby's mouth. There are many more than the few that I've put here as examples, so if you're so inclined, find some of those and make some comments below. Daisy's mouth or her voice, and the link with Gatsby's mouth, his smile or his look. In chapter 1, first we have Daisy. Then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh. And I laughed too and came forward into the room. That's Nick speaking. Again in chapter 1, she hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. So Daisy's voice we first get as a murmur. Again in chapter 1, on this very same page, I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Daisy's voice has now, or the murmur has now evolved into a voice, and that voice is linked to musical notes. Of course, there's also a play on the word with banknotes, which we won't get into today. Again, chapter 1, the next page, her face was sad and lovely, with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth. But there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. More in chapter 1. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing. We get these references to Daisy and her voice because she's the siren of the text. So just notice how many Fitzgerald has put into the first chapter to establish that image This sound that we hear, it seems far off. With the murmur, eventually it's a voice, it's exciting, it's glowing, it has a musicality to it, which the whole text has a musicality to it in many ways. And finally, her voice is glowing and singing in the first chapter. Now we move on to Gatsby. In chapter 4, he smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole external world for an instant, and then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just so far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that, at your best, you hoped to convey. It's a great passage. Gatsby's smile, the first time it's mentioned. Chapter 4 again, there was that smile again, but this time I held out against it. Again, chapter 4, the officer, that's Gatsby, looked at Daisy while she was speaking, in a way that every young girl wants to be looked at sometime, and because it seemed so romantic to me, I have remembered the incident ever since. This is Nick relating what Jordan has told him, and here's both Gatsby's look and Daisy's voice. Looked at Daisy while she was speaking. In chapter 5, we get Daisy. The exhilarating ripple of her voice was a wild tonic in the rain. I had to follow the sound of it for a moment, up and down, with my ear alone before any words came through. We again get that up and down that was referred to earlier as a musical quality to her voice. We get the water imagery of sirens calling in sailors. And here's the exhilarating ripple of her voice, that ripple relating also to more imagery of water. Chapter 5, then from the living room, I heard a sort of choking murmur, and part of a laugh followed by Daisy's voice on a clear, artificial note. Fitzgerald's doing quite a bit with this statement. We get the murmur again from chapter 1. We get Daisy's voice. We get the note referred to Daisy's voice again, and even the kind of humorous irony that he's using. It's an artificial note, not only to show the fake nothingness qualities of Daisy, or lack of qualities, but also a little pun here on Gatsby, known to be in the business of selling false banknotes. Chapter 5, his hand took hold of hers, and as she said something low in his ear, he turned toward her with a rush of emotion. I think that voice held him most with its fluctuating, feverish warmth, because it couldn't be overdreamed. That voice was a deathless song. Again, Daisy's voice, a song like that of the sirens. Ironically, it's not deathless. Chapter 6, they arrived at twilight, and as we strolled out among the sparkling hundreds, Daisy's voice was playing murmurous tricks in her throat. We again get the root word of murmur and Daisy's voice. Chapter 6, he knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So he waited, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon a star. Then he kissed her. And here we have the actual linking of, and this is 5 years earlier, this is a reminiscent moment in the text, 5 years earlier, of Daisy's mouth and Gatsby's mouth coming together. And all of these references throughout the text serve to reinforce that, to link those two together, as well as to establish Daisy as a siren who will be responsible for the death of one of those Dutch sailors, which would be James Gatz or Jay Gatsby. Chapter 6. She's got an indiscreet voice, I remarked. It's full of... I hesitated. Her voice is full of money, he said. Suddenly, that was it. I'd never understood before. It was full of money, that inexhaustible charm that rose and fell in it, the jingle of it, the cymbal song of it. So we get the voice of money, Daisy's voice, and the siren song. Chapter 8. She turned toward him and he kissed her curious and lovely mouth. She had caught a cold, and it made her voice huskier and more charming than ever. And Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves. And that youth and mystery was imprisoned and preserved in Gatsby, as he refused to grow past the idea that a 17-year-old would have. Other cross-references, the repetition of colossal. The definition of colossal, approaching the incredible as if unable to be real or believed, and it's used 4 times in the text. In chapter 1, describing Gatsby's house, Nick says, "The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy." Of course, we have the word colossal here to describe Gatsby's house. He is the Great Gatsby. But also, we have this imitation linked to Gatsby. And remember that Daisy's voice was full of artificial notes, and that Gatsby is the one who is selling fake whiskey or with fake prescriptions, and of course, fake banknotes, fake stocks and bonds. Chapter 5. Daisy put her arm through his abruptly, but he seemed absorbed in what he had just said. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. Again, Fitzgerald uses a single word to link Gatsby and Daisy to each other in multiple ways. Again, in Chapter 5, there must have been moments even that afternoon. This is at the reunion afternoon at Nick's little house, when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams, not through her own fault, but because of the colossal vitality of his illusion. It had gone beyond her, beyond everything. Fitzgerald reminds us of the magnitude of Gatsby's dream, but also that it is an illusion, that the American dream, manifested by Daisy, at least for Gatsby, is an illusion. Chapter 8. But he knew that he was in Daisy's house by a colossal accident. However glorious might be his future as Jay Gatsby, he was at present a penniless young man without a past. So the 4th colossal is the accident that places him in Daisy's house, linking Gatsby and Daisy together through all 4 uses of colossal. So this leads us to everything accidental, once again linking Gatsby to Daisy. In Chapter 3, but as I walked down the steps, I saw that the evening was not quite over. 50 feet from the door, a dozen headlights illuminated a bizarre and tumultuous scene. In the ditch beside the road, right side up but violently shorn of one wheel, rested a new coupe, which had left Gatsby's drive not 2 minutes before. This is the first accident in the text, and this is the accident which left one of the cars without a wheel outside of Gatsby's house. And notice the verbiage used. It was violently shorn of that wheel. We're going to come back to an auto accident with some similar sounding words. Chapter 3. I am careful. No, you're not. Well, other people are, she said lightly. What's that got to do with it? They'll keep out of my way, she insisted. It takes 2 to make an accident. And here we have Jordan and Nick in a minor disagreement, and Nick learning a little bit about Jordan's character, and she talks about 2 needing to get together in some way to make an accident. Chapter 7, they were gone, Daisy and Gatsby. They were gone, without a word, snapped out, made accidental, isolated like ghosts even from our pity. So here we get them linked by the pronoun they and accidental. Chapter 7, we're Myrtle Wilson, her life violently extinguished. The mouth was wide open and ripped at the corners as though she had choked a little in giving up the tremendous vitality she had stored so long. So you remember the use of vitality for Gatsby's illusion. That links him to Myrtle, of course, but here this accident, it's described as violently extinguished, her life violently extinguished. Earlier, the car lost a wheel, and it was violently shorn of that wheel in the very first car accident. Chapter 8. We get back to, he knew he was in Daisy's house by a colossal accident. However glorious might be his future as Jay Gatsby, he was at present a penniless young man without a past. So we get Gatsby and the word accident linking him to Daisy's house, and to Daisy in many ways. And finally, in Chapter 8, at the scene of Gatsby's death, there was a faint, barely perceptible movement of the water as the fresh flow from one end urged its way toward the drain at the other. A small gust of wind that scarcely corrugated the surface was enough to disturb its accidental course with its accidental burden. The accidental course, Gatsby's fate, his life, the way it played out, and the accidental burden, Gatsby himself, but also for Gatsby, the loving of Daisy. Something else Fitzgerald employs to great effect in the text is biblical allusion. He has many, many words which bring to mind biblical phrases or scenes from Bible stories. And with those, with this type of intertextuality, then, we get added layers of meaning. In chapter 3, of course, he describes Gatsby's smiles as a rare smile with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. And on the surface, that doesn't mean anything particular, but when we see all of these references of biblical allusions in relation to Gatsby, this little phrase takes on more meaning. In chapter 3, we get, "And I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, a year or two over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd." Now we all know, according to biblical scholars, Jesus was just a little bit over 30, 32 or 33, at the time of his crucifixion. Chapter 5. "Aware of the loud beating of my own heart, I pulled the door to against the increasing rain." This increasing rain, of course, has Gatsby standing in it outside the door of Nick's house, being baptized. Chapter 6. Talking about the birth of Jay Gatsby from the mind of James Gatz, sprang from his Platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that, and he must be about his father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. So he invented just the sort of Jay Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent, and to this conception he was faithful to the end. There's a lot going on in this passage. Of course, as I said, this is the birth of Jay Gatsby, the very beginning of chapter 6, the description of Gatsby rowing out to Dan Cody's yacht, changing his name while he's heading out there. We have the Platonic conception of himself. This is a play on the Immaculate Conception, the birth of the Son of God. So he's described here as a son of God. But what is his father's business? Notice the use of capital letters. Okay, a King James Version stylistic choice. So here we go with his father's business. And this reminds us that the replacement of God is with capitalism in America. And to this conception, his own immaculate conception, he was faithful to the end, a religious pilgrimage, if you will. Chapter 6, he knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. This reference again to Jay Gatsby and the mind of God. In chapter 7, Daisy and Jordan lay upon an enormous couch like silver idols, weighing down their own white dresses. Again, there's a lot we can unpack in here with materialism and with the emptiness of white, but specifically silver idols. The 30 pieces of silver that Judas used to betray Jesus, and Daisy, of course, betrays Gatsby. Chapter 7, over the ash heaps, the giant eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg kept their vigil. A vigil, of course, doesn't have to be religious or biblical, but it has this sacred quality to it. And we see this linked again, and we've already had, by the way, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg referred to as God. And so we see this linked again with Gatsby. Later in chapter 7, he put his hands in his coat pockets and turned back eagerly to his scrutiny of the house, as though my presence marred the sacredness of the vigil. This is Gatsby watching over Daisy's house after the accident. Chapter 8, he had intended probably to take what he could and go, but now he found that he had committed himself to the following of a grail. This is Gatsby falling in love with Daisy, and it's likened to the following of a grail, the Holy Grail, the cup used at the Last Supper. In chapter 8, Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, of the freshness of many clothes, and of Daisy gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. So now, not just Jordan and Daisy, but specifically Daisy being linked with the silver, which is the image, the money of betrayal. In chapter 8, the track curved, and now it was going away from the sun, which, as it sank lower, seemed to spread itself in benediction over the vanishing city where she had drawn her breath. This, of course, is just a few pages before the end of Gatsby's life, so the benediction. Chapter 8. Gatsby shouldered the mattress and started for the pool. Once he stopped and shifted it a little, and the chauffeur asked him if he needed help. It's almost a comical image, but it's very overt in that Fitzgerald gives us this image of Gatsby shouldering the mattress, which is what he is laying on when he is killed. So instead of the cross and Christ carrying his own cross, Gatsby is carrying this mattress. Of course, it's full of air, it's empty, like the dreams that he followed. And Fitzgerald even includes that instance mentioned in two of the Gospels where Simon asks Jesus if he can help carry the cross, and here we have the chauffeur asking Gatsby if he needs help with the mattress. Other cross references, Fitzgerald's references to the romantic idealism of something akin to the American dream. Now, the phrase the American dream was not used in print until the 1930s, so Fitzgerald, of course, never used it in this text, but he uses a lot of synonyms, wonder, or just the word dream, or promise. And so we have quite a few things that refer to that idea or the romantic idealism of reinventing yourself in America, that Horatio Alger rags to riches story. In chapter 4, the city seen from the Queensboro Bridge is always the city seen for the first time, in its first wild promise of all the mystery and the beauty in the world. In chapter 6, one autumn night, 5 years before, they had been walking down the street when the leaves were falling, and they came to a place where there were no trees and the sidewalk was white with moonlight. Gatsby saw that the sidewalk really formed a ladder and mounted to a secret place above the trees. We have this symbolic image of the trees being a stand-in for climbing the social ladder, and here Fitzgerald again is fairly overt and obvious with his reference to that social ladder by claiming that the sidewalk, as it disappears into the distance, looks like a ladder. Chapter 8. Now for his blurred eyes, and he knew that he had lost that part of it, the freshest and the best, forever. Also in chapter 8, I tossed half sick between grotesque reality and savage, frightening dreams. This is Nick, but we have Fitzgerald describing dreams as savage and frightening. And we're getting near, of course, in chapter 8, we're getting near to Gatsby's death. It is the chapter of Gatsby's death. And Fitzgerald is starting to make a commentary that's pretty obvious regarding his ideas, his cynical ideas and thoughts about the romantic idealism of the American dream. In chapter 8, he was gasping, he was clutching at some last hope, and I couldn't bear to shake him free. This is Gatsby again, clutching at some last hope. Chapter 8, Gatsby himself didn't believe it would come, and perhaps he no longer cared. If that was true, he must have felt that he had lost the old warm world, paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. And the final few paragraphs of the text, there's a few of these references. The old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the new world. Its vanished trees, the trees that made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. So we have this greatest of all human dreams. We have something that is equal to our capacity for wonder. And these are all references to this idea of the American dream. And as I sat there, brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. So Fitzgerald tells us that Gatsby was so close to getting this dream, but that it was already in the past, that this romantic idealism of the American dream by the 1920s, that idealism was dead. It was already behind us. And the text ends with what some see as some really optimistic lines, even after all of this. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.